Before, my husband once promised me that he would only love me in this lifetime, but 5 years later, I saw him at a gathering. He was blocking drinks for another woman. That woman had a slightly bulging belly. She was gently nestled in his arms. He saw me. He was taken aback for a moment, but quickly returned to normal. He said, "Wife, you don't like socializing. All these years, she has accompanied me to those important events. She is carrying my child. Don't make things difficult for her." At that moment, my heart felt like it was being torn apart. It was over. My relationship with him was completely finished. I have a mental cleanliness obsession. I cannot accept a cheating man like him. I absolutely refuse. My complexion turned very bad. It turned pale in an instant. Christopher was standing there, looking into my eyes. The crystal chandelier overhead casts a blinding light. It makes my face look even paler. I stared intently at Christopher. My lips forced a weak smile. It was a smile uglier than crying. "You betrayed me. Don't. Let's go back. I will explain it to you properly." Christopher's Adam's apple moved slightly. He looked at me cautiously. He wants to explain, but he doesn't know how to start. I laughed out of anger. "So, you said you were on a business trip recently. In fact, you were with her." Victoria stepped in front of Christopher. She said firmly, "Don't be angry yet. We didn't betray you. This child was born through in vitro fertilization. I just used Christopher's sperm," she said, looking at me with a dissatisfied expression, as if I were being unreasonable. She continued, "Mrs. Christopher, you can rest assured. I have my own dignity. I won't interfere in someone else's relationship." She speaks with conviction. She appears very upright. Christopher is also staring at me. I understand. He probably thinks I will forgive him once I know the truth. He believes he did nothing wrong. He just helped a capable subordinate fulfill her wish to have a child. Moreover, there was no substantial contact between them, but I felt a wave of dizziness. How can Christopher be so presumptuous? "Christopher, you also think this isn't betrayal?" I still held a glimmer of hope. Christopher looked at me with dissatisfaction. I know him too well, making a scene like this in front of so many people. He feels embarrassed. He thinks I went too far. "Wife, that's enough. So many people are watching, okay?" I stared at him for a while. I straightened my back, turned and walked away. I don't know how I walked away. When I left, I could still hear Christopher softly comforting Victoria. I've met Victoria a few times. She is a beautiful top student who returned from studying abroad. She attracted quite a bit of attention when she first arrived at the company. At that time, many people directly or indirectly reminded me not to let Victoria stay at the company. I was worried Christopher would change his mind, but I just smiled. I had too much confidence in Christopher. I firmly believed he would always be loyal to me. I forgot. Human hearts are inherently complex and changeable. When I got home, I was throwing up uncontrollably. This was the first time I truly understood why it said that the stomach is a reactor of emotions. I was extremely exhausted. After washing up, I was just about to lie down and rest. Suddenly, everything went dark. I collapsed directly, before completely losing consciousness. I heard Christopher hurriedly running towards me. When I woke up again, I found myself lying on a hospital bed. The first thing I saw was the white ceiling. At that moment, I heard someone asking me, "Wife, are you feeling uncomfortable anywhere else?" Hearing Christopher's voice, only then did I realize he was there. I didn't look at him. I said in a hoarse voice, "Let's get a divorce." He was stunned. He immediately grabbed my hand. His eyes were red. He held on tightly, as if afraid I would disappear from his side. In a daze, I remembered when we first met. He was just like this, pulling me hard when I was about to fall apart, begging me not to give up. Before that, I actually didn't know Christopher. At that time, my parents got divorced. They both didn't want me. They both started their own families outside. I felt like I was forgotten by everyone. In despair, I decided to jump from a tall building. Unexpectedly, Christopher suddenly appeared. He grabbed my hand. He pleaded, "Please, don't give up. You must live." He shouted loudly. He begged me not to give up on life. That was the first time I met Christopher. Later, I slowly got to know him. He said he had liked me for 3 years. He never dared to say it. That day, he happened to run into me, seeing that I was not in a good state. He followed me. He held me several times. He said he was glad he appeared in time to save me. That passionate and deep love pulled me back from the brink of withering into despair. I couldn't help but fall in love with him. 2 years after we started dating, we got married. On the day of the wedding, he was as happy as a child who got all the candy. The wedding was particularly grand. Christopher said he wished the whole world knew we were married. That night, He held me tightly. Every word he said was particularly sincere. "Wife, I finally married you. I will love you for a lifetime, but we've only been married for 3 years." He completely shattered my beautiful fantasies about this relationship. The memories suddenly interrupted. The strong smell of disinfectant in the hospital room made it hard for me to breathe. Christopher's hand was still tightly gripping me. "Wife, you said before, no matter how angry we get, we can't casually mention divorce. Christopher wants me to soften," he thought. "As long as I know that Victoria is carrying a test tube baby, I wouldn't make a fuss anymore." Christopher's hand was still tightly gripping me. "Wife, don't be angry anymore, okay? After all, he's the only one by my side now. After all, I love him deeply." I silently watched him. My heart was in immense pain, but my eyes were so dry that not a single tear could fall. "Christopher, can you accept that I have a child with someone else?" "Of course not," he said immediately after he finished speaking. I was stunned. His expression became serious. I slightly curled the corners of my mouth, showing a hint of a cold smile. Then, "Why do you think I would accept such a ridiculous and laughable thing? This child will always stand between us. Christopher will also be tied to Victoria forever because of this child." Christopher seemed to want to argue further, but as soon as he saw my indifferent gaze, he suddenly couldn't speak anymore. He instinctively let go of my hand, muttering softly. At that time, I didn't think too much. Victoria said she didn't want to get married. She just wanted a child. "I just want a child," she begged me. I was just confused and agreed in the moment. After all, Christopher actually really wants a child, but I can't have my own child due to health reasons. I lost my fertility. I fell into water as a child during winter. That caused me to lose my ability to conceive. At that time, I talked to Christopher about my childhood. He held me tightly. He cried even more sadly than I did. He told me, "It's okay not to have children. As long as we are together, that's enough. We've been married for 3 years. Christopher's parents have repeatedly urged us to have children soon." Every time he speaks up for me, to prevent Christopher's dad and mom from having opinions about me. Christopher even fabricated a medical record, claiming that he himself is infertile. He used to treat me really well. Because of that, when he betrayed me, I completely couldn't accept it. I told Christopher, "Me or the child, you can only choose one." I asked him like this, although I know in my heart, he won't give me a satisfactory answer. Christopher fell silent. I also didn't say anything further. The whole atmosphere was so oppressive it was hard to breathe. "Let's get a divorce," I said again. Christopher suddenly looked up. Teardrops flowed uncontrollably. Christopher firmly opposed my idea. He said, "No, I disagree. If you really can't accept it, I will send her and her child away." Since then, he seemed particularly worried that I would leave. He stayed home with me almost every day. Every time I finished the divorce agreement, he acted as if he didn't see it. I deliberately sulked at him, not talking to him, but he didn't care at all. He even smiled and took the blanket and pillow to sleep on the living room sofa. There is a bed in the room, but he insisted on sleeping on the sofa. I understand. He wants me to feel sorry for him, but I didn't pay any attention to him at all. He has been sleeping on the sofa for several days. There are obvious dark circles under his eyes. On that day, Christopher came over while I was drafting the new divorce agreement. "Wife, I have already fired Victoria. Next, should I praise you?" I handed him the divorce agreement, let him take a look. He pretended not to hear. He continued to play dumb. He still wanted to placate me. At that moment, the phone rang. I glanced at my phone. I found that the caller ID was Victoria. Christopher unconsciously looked at me, hesitating. He didn't dare to answer the call, but Victoria seemed very insistent. The phone kept ringing one after another. Every time the phone rang, it made my heart tighten. Christopher was gripping his phone tightly. He wanted to answer but hesitated. I couldn't help but laugh out loud. "Just answer the phone. What if something happened to the child? You are the child's biological father. You should at least show some concern. The child is innocent. This is how you talk about her. This is really a bit too much." He immediately responded. I looked at him with a sarcastic gaze. Christopher's words came to an abrupt stop. The phone's ringing suddenly stopped as well. The tension in the room grew heavier. I handed him the divorce agreement again. He waved it away. He sat helplessly on the sofa. Teardrops flowed uncontrollably. "How can you be so heartless? Do you really love me? Speak up. Being with you is too exhausting. It's clearly just a small matter. Why do you have to take it so seriously?" Christopher suddenly stood up. He continued to express his dissatisfaction. You are like a hole that can never be filled, no matter how much love I give. You will never feel satisfied. You are too heartless. Just like that, you want a divorce. You never think of me. The Christopher family has such a vast fortune. I don't have my own children. Are we just going to give the Christopher group away for nothing? I thought that. He would never make me this sad again. But what he just said completely shattered my heart. The pain feels like a brutal wound. It cuts deep to the bone. After this happened, I cried in front of him for the first time. I suddenly broke down. All the grievances, disappointments, and struggles accumulated over these days. It felt like a huge rock smashing down on me. It caused me immense pain. I can hardly believe it. Christopher actually had so many grievances against me all along. He feels that being with me is a compromise. He feels very oppressed. Now, Christopher is panicking himself. He suddenly realizes what he just said. He hurriedly wants to come over to comfort me. But I pushed him away forcefully. Go away. Don't touch me. I shouted loudly, completely disregarding my image. It's too dirty. Don't touch me. Christopher was stunned for a moment. He had never seen me react this way. At that moment, the doorbell suddenly rang loudly. Christopher seemed to intentionally avoid me. He quickly got up to open the door. As soon as he opened the door, Victoria was standing there. Her face was pale. Her forehead was covered in cold sweat. She said, "My stomach hurts. Help me quickly. Save the child." Victoria was weak. She could only hold tightly to the door frame to avoid falling. Christopher immediately ran over. He picked her up in his arms. He was too anxious. He didn't even have time to greet me, and hurriedly ran out. Due to being too rushed, he even forgot to bring the car keys. I noticed, where Victoria was standing just now, left a few drops of blood. The situation is urgent. I can't just stand by and do nothing. I immediately grabbed the car keys and rushed after them. The lights in the garage were a bit dim. Christopher rushed in. I followed behind them. I saw a large stain of blood on Victoria's white dress. "Christopher, why didn't you answer my call just now?" Victoria's voice sounded very weak. It sounded like it had been soaked in water, soft and feeble. I couldn't see Christopher's expression because he had his back to me, but I could see him holding Victoria tighter. Christopher said nothing. "You love me, don't you? Otherwise, how could you agree to let me have your child?" Victoria continued speaking. In the dim light, I saw her suddenly smile. That smile carried both sadness and strength. I trembled all over, frozen in place, unable to move. The car key was tightly clenched in my hand. My gaze was fixed firmly on Christopher. Then I heard him say, "Hum." In that moment, I seemed to hear the sound of blood flowing quickly through my veins. I was plunged into an endless abyss. Victoria closed her eyes contentedly. Lost consciousness. Christopher panicked. His voice was choked with emotion. "Victoria, Victoria." He tried to open the car door, but realized he didn't have the car key. He was trembling with anxiety. I suddenly remembered the time I was sick. Without a word, he picked me up and ran to the hospital. At that time, his clothes were soaked with my sweat. He kept softly comforting me in my ear. "Don't be afraid. Don't be afraid. I'm here." His anxiety at this moment was entirely for someone else. I steadied my emotions. I stepped forward. He heard the sound and turned around. He saw the car keys in my hand. His eyes brightened instantly. "What are you standing there for? Hurry up and come drive." Christopher shouted at me anxiously. I had never seen him so flustered. He completely lost his usual composure. Right now, he looked like a lost child. I mechanically opened the car door. I sat in the driver's seat. Christopher held Victoria in the back seat. In no time, we arrived at the hospital. Victoria was rushed into the emergency room. Before going in, the doctor couldn't help but scold us. "What's wrong with you family members? If it were any later, the patient would be in danger." Christopher looked dazed. His eyes were red as he stared at the already unconscious Victoria. The door to the emergency room slowly closed. I sat on a chair outside the obstetrics door, dazed. Christopher leaned against the wall. His white shirt was already stained red with blood, but he seemed not to notice. He kept mumbling, "Everything will be all right. Everything will be all right." Just then, sudden rapid footsteps echoed in the hallway. It was Christopher's dad and mom who had rushed over. I stood up. I shouted, "Dad, Mom," but without saying a word, Christopher's mom gave me a loud slap. I involuntarily looked at Christopher. He was also looking at me, but he showed no intention of stepping forward to stop it. Christopher's mom continued to hit me and scold me. "You unlucky fool, unable to bear children yourself, and you won't even let my son have children with others." Do you want the Christopher family line to end? I shook my head. I softly said I was sorry. Then I turned and walked away. As I reached the end, I heard Christopher calling me from behind, but I didn't stop. I continued to move forward. I left the hospital. The sun was blazing. It was so bright I could barely open my eyes. I took out my phone. I dialed a number. Brother, I held back with all my might, not letting the tears fall. I regretted it. I decided to divorce him. I want to see you. Christopher didn't know. I actually have an older brother. That child was born to my father and his ex-wife, and my mother actually got together with my father later. She married my father after the first wife left. My brother was left behind in our hometown. When I was in 5th grade, I found out I had an older brother. At that time, my father was with a young model outside. My mother argued with him all day long. Mom and he are arguing all day long. I ran out in a fit of anger, crying uncontrollably. Later, it was my brother who found me. He brought me back home. At that time, my brother was already in college, although he was only 12 years old. But due to his exceptional talent and intelligence, he was studying in a youth class at a top university in the country. My brother was very indifferent to others, but he showed me an extra warmth. He said, "We are blood related, our fates are the same. It is inherently the strongest alliance in the world." But I dared not face him. I am sorry for him. I am the child of a third party. My birth came with a mistake, but my brother still cared for me and looked after me as before. My brother comforted me on the phone. "Don't cry. Your brother has always been by your side." I couldn't help but cry, "Brother, wait for me. I'll be there soon." This sentence is like a torch in the dark night. It dispelled the darkness around me. "Little sister, I told you, we are bound by blood. I will not let you bear this alone anymore." At this moment, my brother's expression was like a devout believer swearing an oath to the divine. Memories from years ago suddenly flooded my mind. At that time, I had just learned that I could not get pregnant. I was trembling in a corner. My brother appeared once again. He carried me back to Christopher's house. All the way, he kept singing nursery rhymes to me. Before leaving, he told me when I was young and feeling down, Grandma would always sing this song to cheer me up. "Little sister, I hope you can be happy." The memory was suddenly interrupted. Suddenly, I heard hurried footsteps behind me. I turned around to see. It was Christopher. He was out of breath from running. His tie was all askew. He looked at my swollen face with concern. He asked softly, "Wife, does it hurt?" I ignored him. I just said goodbye to my brother. Watching me prepare to leave, Christopher quickly came over and grabbed my hand. "Wife, Victoria is awake. She wants to see you." He suggested he wanted to see me, but I refused. Christopher tightened his grip on my shoulders again. His strength made me feel a bit of pain. He said, "The doctor said her condition is very serious. Just consider it fulfilling the last wish of someone who is about to leave." I felt a sudden tightness in my heart. Is the situation really that serious? In the end, I still followed Christopher up. In the hallway, Christopher's dad and mom shot me a glare and walked away. Arriving at the ward, there was only Victoria inside. She lay weakly on the hospital bed. Seeing me come in, she forced a smile. "Mrs. Christopher, thank you for being willing to see me." Christopher voluntarily left the ward. After a while, the room was left with just me and Victoria. Victoria's hands were trembling a bit. She took out a piece of paper from her bag. It was a statement of relinquishment of custody. I had originally planned to raise the child myself, but after what happened today, I changed my mind. My health isn't very good. It is indeed a bit difficult to take care of him alone. So I want to give the child to you for raising. I hope you can treat him like your own child." I looked at that statement. It seemed ridiculous. I'm not even planning to keep my own child. How could she, Victoria, think that I would be willing to help raise her child, seeing that I had no reaction? Victoria became anxious. She suddenly grasped my hand tightly. Although her body was very weak, her grip was surprisingly strong in the garage. "You heard it. Christopher said he loves me. You, as long as you take good care of this child, Christopher's heart will return to your side. That's all I have to say." I looked at her with a blank expression. I forcefully pried her hand open. I spoke to her word by word. "Your child is your responsibility. Don't try to push it onto me. As for who Christopher likes, I no longer care, because I no longer love him. Love is inherently a fragile thing. In just one night, I realized I no longer loved him. Suddenly, a sound of something falling to the ground came from outside the door. I turned my head and saw Christopher standing at the door. His face was pale. The hope in his eyes faded little by little. "Christopher, Victoria's voice was as weak as a mosquito's buzz. Christopher didn't even look at her. His gaze remained fixed on me. His eyes were filled with despair and panic. I actually heard it. That was just a kind lie he told to reassure Victoria. In reality, he never truly loved Victoria. Moreover, how could I possibly say that I don't love him? Christopher wanted to get closer to me. He whispered, "Wife, you," but he hesitated for a moment. He didn't dare to move closer. I looked at him. My gaze was calm, just like I looked at anyone else, no different at all. At that moment, he realized. It was over between us. Victoria then said, "Christopher, can you help me persuade her to help take care of the kids?" But Christopher suddenly lost control. He rushed forward and grabbed Victoria's neck tightly. He said sternly, "Stop talking. What are you babbling about in front of my wife?" His face was severely contorted, like a wild beast out of control. I've never seen him this insane before. I instinctively took a step back. The veins on Christopher's temple were visibly throbbing. He questioned me. "Why are you trying to provoke my relationship with my wife? Victoria's health has never been good. How can she withstand such torment?" Her complexion was turning purple. The monitor kept sounding alarms. Such a commotion. It alarmed Christopher's dad, Christopher's mom, and a group of doctors and nurses. They rushed in quickly. At this moment, Christopher was still tightly gripping Victoria's neck. People around were trying to pull him away, but they never succeeded. He said angrily, "Who do you think you are? How dare you make my wife help you raise a child?" Christopher was still shouting loudly. I also stepped forward to stop him. "Calm down. Quickly let go." Christopher heard my voice. He calmed down a little. He turned his head to look at me. Teardrops fell down. Christopher's mother slapped him while crying. She said, "You want to kill her? She's still carrying your child." Christopher's father couldn't contain his anger. He picked up a nearby chair and smashed it against his back. With a dull thud, Christopher finally let go. Victoria had already lost consciousness. Her body collapsed weakly back onto the bed. The doctor and nurse quickly rushed in to provide emergency aid. Victoria was sent back to the emergency room again. Christopher's mother was emotionally agitated. She hit and slapped him again. She completely lost her usual graceful image. "Are you crazy? Do you want to destroy the Christopher family?" Christopher kept staring at me. He suddenly laughed. The laughter was somewhat trembling. "If she dies, my wife will forgive me. Enough. I really can't hold it in anymore." He was interrupted directly. Christopher stared at me blankly. Christopher's dad and mom kept blaming him. The surroundings were filled with noise. I stared at Christopher. Calmly said, "You look like this right now. You really look like a person who has lost their mind." Christopher's face suddenly turned pale. I didn't pay attention to him anymore, just turned around and left, walked out of the ward. I immediately noticed my brother at the end of the corridor. He was wearing a neat suit. He looked a bit out of breath after seeing me. He quickly ran towards me. His suit jacket was blowing in the wind like a soaring eagle. He said softly, "Sister." My eyes instantly became moist. I felt like I finally found a place to lean on. All the grievances surged out at that moment. I ran towards my brother, but I dared not look up at him. I was worried he would see me unable to hold back my tears. My brother just smiled. He gently patted my head. Christopher followed behind me. He saw my brother, veins bulged on his forehead, clearly struggling to suppress his anger. "Wife, who is he?" "My brother." I wiped away my tears. I answered calmly. I didn't expect that. This made Christopher even angrier. He was already provoked by me saying in front of Victoria that he didn't love her. Now, suddenly, there's a romantic brother. This completely drove Christopher out of his mind. "You are seeking your own doom." Christopher rushed towards my brother. Seeing him about to make a move, I immediately rushed in front of my brother. My brother reacted even faster. He pulled me behind him in one swift motion, calmly staring at Christopher's out-of-control actions. Perhaps my brother's aura was too strong. Christopher's fist unexpectedly stopped in midair. "Christopher, I shouldn't have let her marry you from the start." My brother's tone was cold and icy. He shielded me behind him. He blocked me completely. I couldn't see Christopher's expression clearly. I could only hear his breathing becoming more and more hurried. In the distance, Christopher's dad and mom have already gone to the emergency room, gradually fading from view. Only then did Christopher realize that something was off. "Who exactly are you?" he asked. "Didn't my sister just tell you?" "I am her biological brother, a brother by blood." Upon hearing this, Christopher's eyes suddenly widened. He suddenly remembered that I had mentioned my biological family before. It seemed there really was a brother. Thinking of this, He slowly calmed down. His gaze passed over my brother. It landed on the small bit of my clothing that was exposed. I'm standing behind my brother. I softly called out, "Wife." At that moment, Christopher's gaze also fell on me. His eyes shone brightly under the glaring lights of the hospital corridor. His expression was filled with pain and pleading. He suddenly started to sob quietly. His body shook uncontrollably. "You just said you didn't love me anymore. You were just saying that in anger, right?" I hadn't had a chance to respond yet. Suddenly, my brother rushed forward. He stepped in front of Christopher in just a few strides. He kicked him hard. Christopher was caught off guard. He slammed against the wall. It made a loud bang. Many passers-by stopped in their tracks. They curiously gathered around. Christopher did not retaliate. He struggled to support himself and stand up. He wiped the blood from the corner of his mouth. The entire process, his gaze remained fixed on me. My brother was relentless. Step forward again, bang his head against the wall. "How could you betray her?" I immediately ran over and grabbed my brother's hand. In the chaos, I accidentally bumped into my brother's Swiss Army knife tucked at his lower back. That was when I was 12 years old. I ran away from home. In the alley, I encountered a few punks with bad intentions towards me. My brother had that knife. He scared off all the troublemakers. "Bro, don't get too worked up." I quietly reminded him. At that moment, a crowd had gathered around us. Christopher's head was bleeding. Blood was dripping down his cheek. He was completely unaware. He just stared at me at that moment. Christopher's mother ran over. She stared at me intently. Victoria almost lost the baby in her womb. "Are you happy now?" I couldn't help but look at Christopher. He didn't even furrow his brow. Isn't he quite concerned about this child? What does Victoria's child have to do with me? That's all. I no longer pay attention to Christopher's mother's cries. I walked straight to the elevator. My brother shot a cold glance at Christopher's mother. He followed right behind me. When the elevator doors closed, I could still hear Christopher's mother crying. "Look at what kind of daughter-in-law you've married. How could she treat her mother-in-law like this?" I moved into my brother's private villa. After he settled me in, he went into his study. By 2 o'clock in the morning, I heard a faint sound downstairs. I walked barefoot to the staircase. I saw my brother with a man I had never seen before. The moonlight streamed in through the floor-to-ceiling windows. It cast a deep shadow on my brother's back. I heard the man say, "The company has grown. It's inevitable that there will be some dirty dealings. Christopher Group is no exception. If you want a divorce, you can try to find a way from this angle." My brother nodded. "Go ahead." "Right, I'm just about to do that. However, Christopher Group is a large enterprise with a 100-year history. If you go after Christopher Group, it will definitely affect many people's interests." I don't care about that. My heart was suddenly struck heavily. I had never experienced such intense familial affection. At this moment, it pulled me out of the darkness. After that man left, I stepped out. "Brother, am I dragging you down?" My voice was a bit choked. My brother looked at me in surprise. Then he smiled. "You don't need to worry about these things. I have been working in the business world for so many years. I am confident in dealing with Christopher Group. Moreover, things don't necessarily have to come to that. Perhaps he will take the initiative to propose a divorce with you." Brother pretends that nothing is wrong, but I know the situation is not simple. I still can't let go in my heart. All these years, on the surface, I've lived a calm and wealthy life in the Christopher family. I have always been excluded and looked down upon by everyone. For Christopher, I silently endured all of this, but I never expected. In the end, even Christopher betrayed me. Brother was like a beam of light in my dark life. At this moment, the doorbell rang. Brother and I exchanged glances. Our eyes revealed the answer to each other. The person outside is likely Christopher. I opened the door. Sure enough, I saw Christopher standing there, looking exhausted. His eyes were filled with struggle and pain. He saw me. His eyes lit up. But soon they darkened again. "Wife, I'm here to take you home," Christopher said. I didn't even have time to speak. The older brother spoke up first. "Go away. You are not welcome here." Christopher ignored his brother's words. He kept staring at me. He said, "Wife, I promise I won't see Victoria again. Can you give me another chance?" I shook my head. I looked at him coldly and said, "We're done, you understand. I cannot accept any betrayal." He hurriedly explained, "I really have nothing with her. We just..." Before Christopher could finish his sentence, his brother threw several photos at his face. The photos fell to the ground. Everyone's attention was focused on the photos. I clearly saw the contents of the photos. All the photos were intimate shots of Christopher and Victoria. Some were taken in the office. Some were at a banquet, and some on a cruise ship. I was momentarily stunned. I had always felt that Christopher had something special for Victoria, but I didn't expect their relationship to have developed to this extent. The two people in the photo are very close. It obviously looks like a couple in love. This makes me doubt. Is the child Victoria is carrying really conceived through IVF? Christopher's face suddenly turned pale. He looked at me helplessly. He wanted to explain but didn't know what to say. He just made the kind of mistakes that many men would make. Victoria is both beautiful and independent. She also exudes the intellectual charm of a mature woman. He just spaced out for a moment. His thoughts drifted for a brief instant. Besides, those powerful men. Who doesn't have a few female friends outside? Christopher saw my mocking gaze. He felt a pang in his heart. He understood. My relationship with him is beyond repair. It's completely over. I bent down to pick up the photo from the ground. Christopher, is the child Victoria is carrying the fruit of your love? The older brother let out a cold laugh. His eyes were filled with contempt for Christopher. Christopher opened his mouth. He wanted to explain, but he couldn't say anything. He was trembling all over. His eyes were full of despair. I forced a smile. Christopher, it's really over between us. You should go if it weren't for the divorce discussion. Don't come looking for me again. Christopher suddenly knelt down. Wife, I truly love you. I just acted impulsively at that time. I made a mistake. The older brother rushed forward. He kicked Christopher hard on the shoulder. Then he pulled me behind him. He said, "Don't you see my sister is in pain? Your presence only makes her feel worse." Christopher slowly sat up. He looked at me with a dazed and helpless expression. It seemed like he had lost all his strength. He covered his face and began to cry. Why is it like this? I don't want to be apart from you." My brother frowned. It seemed like he wanted to do something. I shook my head. I stopped my brother. I squatted down, facing Christopher. I said to him, "Christopher, I no longer love you. Suddenly, I just don't love you anymore. Maybe. Love is inherently something that is easily changed and fragile." Christopher stared blankly at me. He couldn't find a trace of love in my eyes. He reached out his hand. It seemed like he wanted to hold onto me through touch. I quickly stepped back. I said, "Our relationship ends here." That's all I said. I turned and left. Christopher was standing at the door, crying deeply. After I left, my brother and Christopher talked for a while before leaving. By evening, I lay in bed, tossing and turning, unable to sleep. The moonlight outside quietly illuminated the ground. I looked outside through the gap in the curtains. I found Christopher still kneeling at the villa's entrance. 3 days passed. The stock price of Christopher Group plummeted. Shareholders withdrew their funds one after another. It is said that this is because news has emerged that the Christopher family is suspected of tax evasion. Although there is no solid evidence, the impact of this matter is significant. "Brother, did you do this?" I asked my brother. My brother shook his head. "It was Victoria. I just pushed it a little." At this moment, Christopher Group was in turmoil. The once glorious Christopher Group. Now it is on the brink of collapse in this storm. It's truly lamentable. In the hospital room, Victoria gently strokes her belly. When I arrived, I happened to hear her talking to the nurse. "Christopher, is he not here yet?" "Not yet." The young nurse looks at her with sympathetic eyes. Victoria's fingertips gently glide over her slightly rounded belly. She suddenly recalls that night when Christopher held her tightly, his eyes shining with intense light. Christopher said to her, "Victoria, would you be willing to have a child for me?" She chuckled softly. She originally thought Christopher loved her too. Until that day when Christopher tightly gripped her neck. She realized, in Christopher's eyes, she, Victoria, was utterly insignificant. "Victoria." I greeted her. Victoria saw that I had arrived, not surprised at all. He said, "You're here?" I nodded. Victoria looked up at me. Her eyes were filled with hostility. She said without holding back, "You came to find me. Are you trying to get evidence of Christopher Group's tax evasion?" "Yes." I nodded. Victoria laughed. "You really are ruthless. He likes you so much. How could you want to harm him in the end?" He still handed the evidence over to me. Before she left, she reminded me, "If you hand these things over, Christopher will be finished for good." I understand, but I still softened my heart. I still can't forget the life-saving grace from the past. The evidence felt like a hot iron block. It made my hands feel scorched. In the evening, Christopher called me. "Wife, thank you." "What are you thanking me for?" "Thank you for going easy on me." I was stunned. The hand holding the phone unconsciously clenched. Christopher's voice on the other end was calm. "That day, your brother and I talked a lot. He said the Christopher Group is about to collapse. He told me not to drag you down. Wife, I have decided to let go. Unknowingly, my tears fell down. In the next 2 days, I still did nothing. The Christopher Group held a press conference. I witnessed everything in the crowd. Christopher stood on stage, wearing a sharp suit. The Christopher Group indeed has tax evasion issues. I take full responsibility for this. After he finished speaking, when he was taken away by the police, he suddenly turned around and smiled at me. My brother placed his hand on my shoulder, comforting me. After Christopher was taken away, Christopher Group was in chaos. Christopher's dad and mom were looking everywhere for help, but it was of no use. They blamed Victoria for the responsibility. They were filled with resentment towards her. The news was leaked by Victoria. One night, Victoria had just been discharged from the hospital. She was pulled into an alley and beaten by a group of people. The next morning, people on the street found her. At that time, she was already in critical condition. The baby in her womb had long stopped breathing. Months later, Christopher Group went bankrupt. Christopher faced the fate of imprisonment for tax evasion. He was about to face jail time. After I heard the news, I didn't feel happy at all. Instead, I felt a wave of disappointment. I visited Christopher in prison. He was wearing a prison uniform. He looked very downcast. He has completely lost his former noble demeanor. You're here. He seemed very happy when he spoke. I looked at him. I handed over the divorce agreement. Sign here. He smiled helplessly. He picked up the pen and signed his name. I quietly watched him after signing. His eyes were red. He looked up at me. You must take good care of yourself in the future. I will. I'm sorry. I didn't respond. I don't blame you anymore. Christopher, in fact, I should thank you for saving me back then. There were tears in Christopher's eyes. He said, I understand. The girl I liked has always been very kind. It was I who let you down, the day I came out of prison. The sun was shining brightly. I went to my brother's company. I started from the most basic work. Although work is hard, I feel particularly relaxed and at ease. Through my own efforts and diligence, I gradually earned the recognition of my colleagues. I also received praise from my brother. 10 years later, I am walking in the park with my adopted daughter. I happen to see a familiar figure. It's Christopher. He seemed a bit awkward after seeing me. He lowered his head. He was wearing simple and plain clothes. He no longer has the charm of his younger days. I smiled and nodded at him. Our eyes met. Only wishes for each other remained. My daughter curiously asked me, Mom, who is that uncle? He looks like he might cry. I looked over in surprise. Christopher's head was lowered even more. After a long time has passed. I heard him say very softly, Goodbye. He turned and walked away. I watched him gradually walk further away. I held my daughter's hand tightly. I also whispered something to him, Goodbye.